Dream Psychology, Chapter 10, The Unconscious Motive and Interest. We must now consider dreams in a more intimate manner. We must look for motives that are more personal. The unconscious motive behind the dream is comparable to the conscious motive behind an action. If a man walks down the street and bows to every letterbox, people at once try to interpret the meaning of the action. They act on the assumption that there is a motive behind it. If they can find none, they may look upon him as a madman. That is taking up the view that there is no motive behind the actions of a madman. In the madman, the normal interaction between the conscious and unconscious psyche is disturbed and an intrusion of latent or unrefracted material occurs. It is this same nascent material that forms the dream. It must contain a motive in the sense that it is a psychical force. It tends to go in a certain direction. It makes the madman do or say or think certain things. It shapes dreams in a particular mold. These may seem chaotic as long as they are taken literally. The action of a man going through some elaborate symbolic ritual, like that of a Mohammedan at prayer, appear chaotic in a similar way to an unsympathetic observer. To understand the unconscious motive, it's necessary to understand the symbolism in which it clothes itself. In handling a dream, the aim is to discover the motive of the unconscious. This motive is significant to the dreamer, for it represents a tendency or a force or a bias that exists in himself. In the case of the neurotic, it reveals what's going on behind the scene. And if we look on the neurotic as a person in whose psychic many abnormal strains and counter-strains exist, which he does not understand, it is evident that its discovery is very valuable. And it is not only valuable in the case of the neurotic. In looking for the motive in the dream, one has to look at the same time at something else. To recall for a moment the allegory of the master, the servant, and the act of violence, it is natural, if we wish to understand the motive behind the act of violence, to seek to understand the attitude of the master toward the servant, the attitude of the conscious mind, which is compared to that of the master, requires to be understood by examining the unconscious motive, and simultaneously the attitude of the conscious mind is made clearer as the unconscious motive reveals itself. The whole question centers around the expression of interest. It concerns the sources of outlet that interest finds through the conscious. We may criticize a man on two counts. One is for some kind of excess, a too great vanity or talkativeness, or avariciousness, or sensuality, or diligence, or piety. The other is for some deficiency. He is stupid or mean or narrow or shy or lazy. If these qualities be turned into terms of interest, we can say that in a general sense we criticize a man either for an overexpression of interest in some form or for an underexpression. A theory of interest becomes possible. That force that reveals itself as interest can be called, for short, interest. And interest is now in italics. It flows in many directions, and the directions in which it flows make a man what he is. In using the term interest instead of life force or élan vital, in brackets Bergson, or libido, in brackets Freud, is open to objections in that it is unscientific. It may be said it is a vague term, and that the idea of the libido is more concrete. But there is a certain danger in using a term like libido because it helps to strengthen a one-sided view of life. Its advantages may consist in the fact that it constantly reminds us that sexuality enters very much into life and that we are apt to forget it at times. We have only to look at academic textbooks of psychology to realize that, but it may remind us too much of this and so exclude the other sides of life. The ideal word has yet to be found. If it is said that to speak of interest and to treat it as an energetic conception, which can cover all aspects of life, is unscientific, is unscientific because it is too vague, it is possible to reply that this is the kind of thing that may be needed in psychology. We need a central conception that constantly reminds us that in psychology, though we may discover approximations that are useful and serve as outlines for theories and are supported by practice, nevertheless, no theory will ever imprison and fix life in a rigid formula. And the reason of that is psychological itself and can be given now, although it anticipates part of our thesis. For no sooner do we make the fact wholly conscious and apply a sharply cut definition than it becomes possible for nascent material to form below consciousness. It is owing to this that treatment is possible in psychological medicine. It is for this very reason that the purely scientific spirit in psychology continually undermines the rigid structures it erects. For the nascent formulations below consciousness do not represent what is isolated and circumscribed in consciousness. In order to develop the theory of interest, some brief dream examples can be cited. A spinster who, living in solitary, emotionless life and rarely went out, although perfectly healthy, experienced a recurring dream. She dreamed that she saw pools of stagnant water. It was always stagnant water in some form, never running water. How can we look on this symbolism? When it is said that a man's life is stagnating, it is meant that such a person takes little or no interest in things. Like the servant in the parable, he keeps his talent wrapped in a napkin. It may be for fear of losing it, or for other reasons. What is stagnating? Interest is stagnating, which should flow out through some channel of expression. Of a person who stays indoors absorbed in studying mathematics, one does not say that he is stagnating. His interest flows along an inner channel of expression. There is constant movement in his mind. But a person who stays indoors and does nothing is certainly stagnating. Interest in such a case is held up. It is dammed back. It flows nowhere. It lies, we may say, in stagnant pools like water. We may see in the dreams of the spinster a symbolism that represents an inner situation. It represents the state of that force that reveals itself as interest. It is stagnant interest. But it may be said that a great many spinsters stay indoors and do nothing and never dream of stagnant water or anything at all. That is perfectly clear. A great many people have little interest to draw upon any circumstances. The potentiality for interest is not the same in different people. It may be satisfied by looking after a parrot and wrangling with a servant. The full development of interest in a yokel is not similar to the full development in a cockney. There is no rule to be laid down, save that there is no rule. The study of dreams and symbolism and their bearing on one particular individual does not necessarily throw any light on the dreams of another individual. The symbol of water in dreams is frequently a significance similar to the one suggested in the above case. Another example can be given. It was the dream of a schoolboy. At the time, he was in a form presided over by a man whom he was in great of whom he was in great terror. His terror interfered with his progress, and he remained in the form because his natural capacities were paralyzed. The position was one from which he despairingly thought there was no escape. He imagined he would remain forever at the bottom of that form. I dreamed that I was in a swimming bath full of water. My form master stood on the edge in a red bathing suit and pushed me away with a long pole whenever I tried to climb out. I swam round and round in despair. That the symbolism of the dream has something to do with his position is not difficult to see. But what does the water represent? It is water confined in a small space, and on the confines of that space stands the form master, whose stupid bullying is the cause of the lad's backwardness. What is the confined thing in the dreamer's self? It is, presumably, his interest, which cannot flow out and contribute to the growth of his mind and character. The boy brooded over his position, with that peculiar absorption only possible in sensitive types. The tougher mind is constantly detaching itself from alarming problems and keeping a requisite amount of free interest in hand. The sensitive mind has a much greater difficulty. It fails to detach itself without help, and accumulation begins round the nucleus from which it cannot free itself. In this case, the problem is the form master, and the accumulation may proceed until an abnormal amount or potential of unexpressed or nascent interest is held up, as a dream is held up by an obstruction and forms a lake. A symbol, such as swimming bath filled with water, might express the inner state of affairs in such a case. To the schoolboy we may proffer the useless advice that he should try to forget about it all. That is, he should take his interest off the matter. But this is only halfway advice. The way of forgetfulness must be shown to him. Forgetting in this sense means the removal of an abnormal and useless accumulation of interest, and comes only by drawing it off into another channel. The water in the swimming bath required to be drawn away. His cure did not lie in mere negation. Let me start that sentence over again. His cure did not lie in mere negation, however passionate, or in a direct attack of his fear. He was not equal to that. It lay in an active process, inseparable from growth. For so much as a dream was possible, so long did he remain in a state of arrested development. The pent-up interest, symbolized as water, represented that force that should have gone to personal development, and which then lay useless in confinement. I have drawn together these two dreams coming from divergent sources, because in each the symbol of water appears with a similar significance. It must not be thought that the symbol of water in a dream always denotes the same thing. There is no fixed symbolism. There is only a tendency found. Also in art, music, literature, and common speech, to use certain symbols for expressing certain meanings. There is a symbolism that stamps each age, while the spirit of that age remains uniform. Its symbols retain a fairly constant value. The same thing might be said of individuals, but there is a gradual ebb and flow of interest around each symbol, for no one remains stationary, so that a man may interpret in one way when he is 30 and another way when he is 35. The symbol of the cross has a particular value now. That is, interest of a certain kind surrounds it. 2,000 years ago, it had no such general value. 2,000 years hence, it may have another value. A chemist might dream of water and associate it with coming experiment. A soldier in the trenches might associate it with suffering. A theologian might see it as a mystic essence. And by the very fact that we give some fringes of consciousness definition through association and thought to a symbol, we thereby alter it in some degree forever in its personal application. It can never be quite the same. The balance of interest between the conscious and unconscious has been tilted, however imperceptibly. A new adjustment has set in. The idea of interest being comparable to water in that it may run as a current or be held up in stagnation gives us a valuable key to understanding of problems of personality. A valuable key to the understanding of problems of personality. For it is then like electricity that runs through the subways of a city and spreads out into 1,000 visible expressions of force. It is like the stream that works a factory full of the most varied machinery. The conception belongs to the energetic view of human faculties. The old idea of the facultative school was that the faculties were primary and irreducible qualities. But this view looks on the various faculties displayed in man as being the various manifestations of one force, just as the brilliance of the arc lamp, the coolness of the fan, the heat of the radiator, and the noise of the telephone bell are all expressions of electricity. We have, as it were, a number of instruments through which primal energy runs. We have various interests, and behind them all lies the same force, the force that reveals itself as interest. This view, though it may seem simple, and one that is borrowed from physical science, is of the greatest value in practical work, for it is at once apparent that interest flowing excessively in one direction necessarily means a deficiency in another direction. It gives a firm basis for all analysis, and it makes possible the formula that there is only one problem in life: the proper use of interest. It is with the utilization, expression, and application of interest that the unconscious continuously concerns itself. For if we can conceive of the force that reveals itself as interest, always welling up from the deeper levels of the psyche beneath consciousness and seeking some outlet like spring water through the fissures and crannies of the ground. With this brief outline of the theory of interest, the meaning of what has been called the unconscious motive becomes clearer. The unconscious motive must center around the question of the outlet of interest. A man who watches water bubbling up through the ground does not know what secret pressures and strains or what cisterns and occlusions exist deep beneath the surface. He has no means of estimating. But in the human psyche, the case is different, for the dream comes through the multitude of conscious affairs as a kind of estimate of the relative tensions of interest below the surface. It has its own kind of emphasis and symbolism, and by a proper approach it throws light on interior problems that would otherwise remain obscure. And I'm going to pause here and continue this chapter next time. Till soon.